The air in the terminal pressed thick and humid, a typical mid-June haze that seemed to glue the crisp uniforms of the Aeroflot crew to their skin. But the tension clinging to this corner of the airport wasn't meteorological. It was political, a specific gravity generated by the presence of four men who weren't pilots or mechanics. They were KGB. Agent Valery Sokolov, nominally a security attaché, but in reality a handler with the Soviet delegation, adjusted the knot of his tie. His eyes, small and cold, didn't scan the brightly lit hall. They locked onto their target, a young man who moved with a singular, restless energy even while standing still. Rudolf Nureyev, all sharp angles and defiant posture, was a supernova of talent and a black hole of unpredictability. He was the most famous dancer the Soviet Union had produced since the war, and his defection would be a catastrophic embarrassment, a high-kicking middle finger to the entire cultural propaganda machine. Nureyev was here, reluctantly, at the end of a triumphant European tour with the Kirov Ballet, cut short by the center's direct order. The official reason given to the French hosts and the public was a sudden need for him to dance at the Kremlin. The unofficial reason, the one Sokolov knew, was a series of flagrant breaches of conduct, consorting with Westerners, accepting gifts, and, most damningly, displaying an insatiable, reckless hunger for the freedom the West offered. The center had been watching. The surveillance reports from London and Vienna had been meticulous, detailing every late night, every forbidden friendship. Now, the tether was being pulled. Sokolov stood near the check-in counter, his bulky frame a study in stillness next to the bustling activity of the terminal. His radio, a small, heavily modified R350, was clipped to his belt beneath his jacket, the earpiece a barely visible flesh-colored button in his left ear. Two other agents, Makarov and Dmitri, were positioned discreetly. Makarov near the baggage claim, reading a French newspaper he didn't understand, and Dmitri by the glass doors leading to the tarmac. A fourth man, their nominal superior, Major Anatoly Bulachev, stood a few yards away, engaged in a highly audible, fake conversation with a French airport official about passport control procedures. The trap was classic KGB operational procedure, a soft perimeter designed to appear innocuous until the moment the target was inside the cage. Nureyev was currently flanked by two members of the Kirov management team, both of whom were loyal party members and effectively his closest chaperones. They were being overly solicitous, a sickly sweet attempt at reassurance that masked their true purpose, ensuring the prodigal son stepped onto the Aeroflot flight to Moscow. Rudolf, the plane is waiting. One of them, a man named Sergei, urged, his voice oily. The major says you have a fantastic seat. Nureyev didn't answer immediately. He was looking past them, toward the glass wall that separated the terminal from the outside world. His breathing was shallow. He saw two people, a Chilean couple he had befriended during the tour, Clara Saint and her friend, who were supposed to meet him for a farewell coffee but had, crucially, been permitted through the initial security checkpoint. This was the moment of maximum danger. The Kirov delegation and the KGB knew he was volatile, but they assumed his obedience. The Soviet system bred a deep, paralyzing fear of consequence. That was the main deterrent. No one, not even the great Nureyev, walked away from this kind of escort. Sokolov watched as Nureyev took a step toward the French couple, a casual, almost unnoticed movement. Sergei grabbed his elbow, a gesture that was too familiar, too proprietary. Nureyev instantly recoiled, his face flashing with pure, incandescent rage that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a calculating, cold focus. He spoke in Russian, a low hiss intended only for the KGB agents and the Kirov chaperones. I need to say goodbye to my friends. A moment, he insisted, the word moment an outright lie. Major Bulachev, alerted by the sudden tension, abandoned his charade with the French official and strode quickly toward the group. His face was set in the mask of a stern, protective father. No, Rudolf, it's time to go. We are running late. Nureyev's heart hammered against his ribs. The distance to Clara Saint was perhaps 30 feet, a chasm in the current context. He could feel the weight of Sokolov's gaze on the back of his neck, the invisible handcuffs clicking into place. If he moved too slowly, if he hesitated, he was gone, back to the cultural prison he knew as the Soviet Union. The plane's propellers were already turning outside. He had to make a choice, right now, with the clock running down. He had to run, but running into the terminal was useless. He needed a sanctuary, a flag of protection. He needed the West. He took a deep breath, and his feet, trained for the precision of the ballet stage, executed a lightning-fast, deceptive pivot. Instead of moving toward the gate, he lunged a sudden, powerful surge of energy directly toward Clara Saint and the glass wall. It was not a dance move. It was a desperate, chaotic sprint for life. Rudolf Nureyev's sudden, explosive movement sliced through the tense quiet of the terminal like a thrown blade. It was a reaction perfected not on the stage, but in the feral, survivalist instincts of a man who had grown up desperately, wanting more than the gray strictures of the Soviet system allowed. He covered the 30 feet in perhaps 3 strides, a blur of movement that caught the 4 Soviet agents and the 2 Kirov functionaries completely flat-footed. Agent Valery Sokolov, nearest to the initial point of contact, reacted first. His training kicked in, overriding the shock. He roared a command in Russian. Stop him. Seize him. But Nureyev was already past the point of no return. Sokolov's hand shot out, attempting to catch the back of the dancer's stylish, un-Soviet jacket, but he grasped only air. The Kirov functionary, Sergei, recovered a half-second later and stumbled into an ill-coordinated, panic-stricken chase, yelling incoherently. Nureyev reached the Chilean couple, Clara Saint, a young, socially prominent woman who understood the high stakes of this encounter, and her friend. He didn't pause to greet them. He didn't slow down. He dove straight toward the nearest symbol of French authority, a pair of gendarmes patrolling the area near the international check-in kiosks. I wish to be free, Nureyev shouted, switching instantly from Russian to his heavily accented, yet clear, English. I ask you to protect me. The shout was a cry for help, a political statement, and a carefully calculated legal maneuver, all wrapped into one moment of raw panic and defiance. The French police officers, Lieutenant Bernard and Sergeant Dubois, stopped dead. They were accustomed to paperwork, lost luggage, and the occasional drunken traveler, not a world-famous, wildly gesticulating Soviet artist throwing himself at their feet. They saw the ensuing commotion. The 4 large, rapidly advancing men in identical grim suits, shouting foreign commands and pushing past bystanders. Major Bulichev, realizing the situation had become utterly public, abandoned all subtlety. His face was scarlet with fury and fear of the inevitable report to Moscow. He bellowed in Russian, the command laced with absolute authority. He is mentally unstable, a security risk. He belongs to the delegation. He then attempted a transition into passable, frantic French, but the language failed him in his panic. He is sick. ILS malade. We must take him for treatment. Sokolov, following Bulichev's lead, attempted to physically intercede. He made a dash around a confused group of American tourists, his heavy leather shoes slipping momentarily on the polished floor. Nureyev, already behind the gendarmes, spun to face his pursuers, his arms outstretched, a position of dramatic defense that, ironically, resembled the opening posture of a ply. Clara Saint, showing remarkable presence of mind, immediately placed herself physically between Nureyev and the charging Major Bulichev. She spoke rapidly to the French officers in perfect Parisian French, her voice ringing with authority and outrage. These men are attempting to kidnap him. He is asking for asylum. Do not let them touch him. The legal implications of the word asylum hit the French officers with the weight of international law. In the midst of the Cold War, a high-profile defection wasn't a matter of airport security. It was a diplomatic incident. The police were instantly paralyzed. Their orders were simple: maintain peace and order, but they had no mandate to interfere in what now looked like an attempted extraction by Soviet intelligence on sovereign French soil. They formed a tight, silent cordon, placing their own bodies between the frantic KGB men and the desperately breathing dancer. Sokolov stopped short, his training locking his reflexes. He could not, under any circumstances, risk an open, physical altercation with French police, not in a brightly lit, packed public airport. That would guarantee a diplomatic rupture of the highest order. He pulled back, his jaw clenching, substituting physical violence for blistering, whispered threats in Russian aimed directly at Nureyev, threats of retribution against his family back in Ufa. Nureyev, clinging to the gendarme's sleeve, shook visibly but held his ground. "I will not go back," he cried, his voice breaking. "I am a slave. I will not return." Major Bulachev was now face-to-face with Lieutenant Bernard. The major's eyes darted frantically between the resolute, silent French policeman, the defiant dancer, and the distant, turning propellers of the waiting Aeroflot jet. The entire meticulously planned KGB extraction, a classic soft operation, had disintegrated in 30 feet and 5 seconds of anarchic, defiant sprint. Bulachev knew he was watching his career and possibly his freedom evaporate. His last desperate move was to play the victim. He dramatically straightened his jacket and addressed the lieutenant in clipped, formal Russian, clearly intending for the words to be translated later. "You are interfering in an internal matter of the Soviet state. This man is ill. Your government will hear of this outrage." Lieutenant Bernard, a career policeman, remained impassive, simply tilting his head towards Nureyev. "Monsieur, do you formally request the protection of the French Republic?" Nureyev pushed past the lingering terror, planted his feet, and met the eyes of the officer. "Yes," he stated, the single word ringing out with final, absolute conviction. The battle of wills was over. The dancer had won the opening skirmish. The KGB's window of opportunity, the critical time between the final decision to defect and the physical impossibility of stopping it, had snapped shut. Sokolov watched as the gendarmes slowly and deliberately escorted Nureyev and Clara Saint away, walking them toward the security offices where the formalities of political asylum would begin. The plane waited. The agents watched. The dancer walked. And the Cold War had just gained its most glamorous and most embarrassing new symbol. The immediate aftermath of the dash was not the triumphant release Nureyev might have envisioned. Instead, it was a sudden, chilling immersion into the glacial pace of Cold War bureaucracy. The airport police office, a cramped, smoke-filled room with chipped paint and an overflowing ashtray, became the new, temporary cage. Lieutenant Bernard, though professionally obligated to protect Nureyev, was overwhelmed. He understood the scale of the international incident unfolding on his watch. Nureyev sat on a hard wooden bench, his chest still heaving, while Clara Saint stood protectively by his side, speaking urgently into a borrowed phone. The French officers were making calls up the chain of command, to the Prefecture of Police, the Ministry of the Interior, and most crucially, the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry. Every phone call was a ticking clock, every moment of silence, a terrifying vacuum where the KGB could potentially reorganize. Outside the thin office door, the Soviet presence hadn't vanished. It had coalesced. Major Bulachev and Agent Sokolov stood with the two Kirov functionaries, arguing fiercely with a uniformed police sergeant. Their tone was now less aggressive threat and more righteous indignation, a switch to the diplomatic offense. "This is an illegal detention of a Soviet citizen," Bulachev insisted, waving a passport. "We are the official escorts. His passport is ours. He is a minor member of our cultural delegation. This is an insult to the Franco-Soviet Cultural Exchange Treaty." Sokolov, silent and focused, scanned the area, his mind working through contingency plans. The primary extraction had failed. Now, Plan B, coercion via diplomatic pressure and misinformation. He knew that if the French government didn't act decisively, the pressure from the Soviet embassy, a massive, immediate storm of diplomatic notes and high-level demands, could compel the French authorities to simply hand the dancer over. It had happened before. All they needed was a few hours of official indecision. Inside the office, Nureyev's nerves were fraying. He was pouring out the truth of his life to a skeptical but attentive Lieutenant Bernard. He spoke of the restrictions, the constant surveillance even in Paris, the party functionaries who monitored his every interaction, the seizure of his earnings, the crushing feeling of being owned by the state. He described the sudden, unexplained order to return to Moscow, knowing it meant not a special performance, but exile to a provincial troop, or worse, a forced re-education through menial labor. "They control the air I breathe, Lieutenant," Nureyev pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm a dancer. My art is not for the party. It is for the world. If I go back, they will break me. They will not allow me to dance again." Clara Saint, meanwhile, was using her connections. On the phone, she reached a high-level contact, a friend of her family with influence in government circles. She didn't mince words. "We have Rudolf Nureyev here at Le Bourget. He has asked for asylum. The Soviets are outside the door right now, demanding he be released to them. If the foreign ministry doesn't intervene immediately, he will be returned to Moscow and his life will be destroyed. This is a chance for France to show the world where it stands." The word spread rapidly through the Quai d'Orsay, reaching the desk of a senior official who specialized in Soviet matters. The official, acutely aware of the delicate balance of détente, the easing of strained relations, weighed the consequences. Handing Nureyev over would appease Moscow and avoid a headache. Granting asylum would infuriate the Kremlin and be touted as a propaganda victory for the West, but would also elevate France's cultural standing and underscore its commitment to human rights. The decision landed. France would accept the defection. A formal, confidential instruction was relayed down the line. Protect the dancer. Isolate the Soviets. Escort him away from the airport premises without incident. But Bulachev and Sokolov were not fools. They were monitoring the frantic activity of the French police, watching the movement of unmarked vehicles. They knew their window of diplomatic opportunity was closing. Major Bulachev decided on a final, direct confrontation. He pushed past the sergeant at the door and confronted Lieutenant Bernard inside the office, his voice low and dangerous. "Lieutenant," Bulachev stated, adopting a grim professionalism, "we have received instructions from Moscow. We are permitted to offer him a final chance. Let me speak to him alone. I will ensure he understands the consequences for his family, for his mother." The mention of his mother, a woman Nureyev loved deeply, was a psychological weapon, cold and precise. Nureyev's already pale face went chalk white. He surged forward, rage momentarily overcoming fear, but Bernard placed a hand firmly on the dancer's chest, holding him back. "Major," Bernard replied, his voice calm, resolute. "I have received my own instructions. Monsieur Nureyev is under the protection of the French Republic. You will not speak to him. You will vacate this office immediately." It was a clear, unambiguous order of failure. Sokolov and Bulachev exchanged a look of pure, frustrated impotence. The bureaucratic wall had been erected. The KGB, masters of covert operations, had been defeated by a young woman's decisiveness and a French lieutenant's adherence to official policy. The dancer was officially untouchable. Outside the Le Bourget police office, the air had gone strangely still, the buzzing tension replaced by the cold, heavy weight of failure. Major Bulachev didn't immediately move. He stared at the closed door, his mind racing through the sequence of events, desperately searching for a single procedural error, a single way to retroactively assign blame to someone other than himself. Agent Sokolov, ever the pragmatist, was already focused on the next critical phase, damage control and immediate reporting to the center in Moscow. Sokolov pulled Bulachev aside, his voice a low, urgent murmur that cut through the terminal noise. "Anatoly, it's finished here. We have minutes before the press descends. We must leave this airport. Now." Bulachev slowly nodded, the defeat settling deep in his posture. His career, the years of steady, loyal work, was now defined by this single, catastrophic failure. The loss of Nureyev was not just the loss of a dancer. It was a profound failure of the Soviet system's ability to control its most visible assets. It represented a propaganda victory for the West that would be replayed on every radio and television screen for weeks. Their first action was to secure a telephone line that couldn't be easily tapped by French intelligence. A payphone in a dark corner of the international departures area, far from the police activity. Bulachev took the receiver, his hand shaking slightly as he dialed the coded number for the Soviet embassy's secure communications line in Paris. The exchange was terse, formal, and utterly devastating. Report from Le Bourget. Code name Swan. Bulachev spoke into the receiver, referring to Nureyev's internal file designation. The asset attempted extraction from the Republic's jurisdiction at 1745 local time. The operation was compromised by unexpected, non-official intervention from French civilians and subsequent formal intervention by airport law enforcement. The asset formally requested asylum. Status lost. He listened to the silence on the other end, which was colder and more accusing than any shouted reprimand. The voice that finally came back, a senior embassy official who would now have the unenviable task of informing the Politburo, was flat, devoid of emotion. Confirmed. Return to the embassy immediately. Prepare a full, written operational report for secure transmission tonight. All details. Who and what was said. Do not omit the involvement of the Frenchwoman. You are under no circumstances to make contact with the asset again. Discontinue further attempts at retrieval. Await further instructions. As Bulachev hung up, he looked at Sokolov, the grim realization of their task washing over them. They were tasked not just with reporting the failure, but with constructing the official Soviet narrative of the defection, a document designed to protect the system and minimize the dancer's significance. The narrative would have to be airtight. Nureyev was not a political dissident, but an unstable, arrogant narcissist seduced by Western decadence and misled by agents of foreign intelligence. He was a small, unfortunate anomaly, not a symbol of systemic repression. The official cover story, crafted by the center even as Bulachev spoke, would claim Nureyev was suffering from acute, incapacitating nerves and had been tricked into seeking asylum. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Lieutenant Bernard received the final set of instructions. Nureyev was to be moved immediately. A discreet, unmarked black Citroën DS, a symbol of French sophistication and authority, was dispatched to a rear service entrance. The goal was to spirit the dancer away before the press, which was already beginning to swarm the main terminals, could spot him and turn the defection into a zoo. Nureyev and Clara Saint were bundled quickly out of the back office, under the protective cover of two plainclothes security officers. The rush of cold evening air on the tarmac was the first truly free sensation Nureyev had experienced in months. He looked back at the main terminal, spotting the figures of Bulachev and Sokolov standing near the glass, watching their retreat, their faces obscured by the reflective glass, but their posture radiating thwarted malice. As the Citroën accelerated out of the airport compound, Nureyev finally allowed himself a moment of genuine relief. He was safe, for now, out of the immediate physical grasp of the KGB. But the KGB's work was far from over. Back at the embassy, Sokolov was already gathering surveillance reports and transcripts of Nureyev's conversations in Paris. The new phase of their operation was beginning, retribution and psychological warfare. They knew exactly how to target a man like Nureyev, not with guns, but with the cold, precise leverage of the family he had left behind in the Soviet Union. The pressure would begin, not on the defector, but on his mother, his sister, and the remaining members of the Kirov ballet troupe who would now face intense scrutiny. Nureyev might have escaped, but his life was now irrevocably tied to the fate of those he loved, a powerful, emotional anchor the KGB intended to tug on with maximum force. The black Citroën DS sped through the Parisian twilight, a sleek, powerful vessel carrying its precious, highly publicized cargo. Rudolf Nureyev sat rigidly in the back seat, still vibrating with adrenaline, next to Clara Saint, his impromptu savior. The vehicle was headed for an undisclosed, secure location, a safe house arranged by the French authorities, but the immediate destination was Clara's family apartment near the Bois de Boulogne, a temporary and trusted sanctuary. For the first time in his 23 years, Nureyev felt a physical absence of surveillance. The constant, nagging presence of a shadow, the awareness of listening ears and judging eyes that defined life in the Soviet Union, had lifted. He found himself inhaling deeply, the air, simply air, feeling different, lighter. When they arrived at the elegant apartment building, the silence was palpable. Clara's family were quickly briefed and immediately understood the gravity of the situation, offering quiet, unconditional support. Nureyev was ushered into a large, sunlit drawing room, where he simply stood, absorbing the sight of a room filled with books, paintings, and records, a collection acquired not through party allocation, but through personal choice and Western disposable income. It was an overwhelming display of individual freedom. The moment he was truly alone, in a guest room where the door could be locked from the inside. The immediate euphoria was replaced by a crushing wave of emotional and physical exhaustion. His body, trained to the limits of human performance, finally gave way to the trauma of the chase. He paced the room, a caged animal suddenly released into a much larger, but still unfamiliar, space. The terror of the airport was replaced by the cold, heavy fear for his family. He knew what the KGB would do. They wouldn't touch his mother, but they would make her life a constant, agonizing nightmare of interrogation and suspicion. They would revoke her privileges, ensure her neighbors and friends viewed her with contempt, and stop her from ever leaving Ufa, effectively holding her hostage to her son's rebellion. This was the cost of his freedom, a debt he felt immediately and painfully. Clara Saint, showing a maturity beyond her years, understood the complexity of his situation. She brought him food, wine, and, most importantly, a stack of newspapers the following morning. The defection was already the global headline. Le Monde ran a banner story, "The Leap to Freedom, Kirovstar Defects in Paris." The coverage was sensational, painting Nureyev as a hero of the free world, a symbol of the superiority of Western culture. For Nureyev, seeing his face plastered across the front pages wasn't simple vanity, it was insulation. He was now too famous, too potent a propaganda weapon for the French government to abandon. The sheer publicity was his bulletproof vest against the silent, insidious reach of the KGB. However, the reality of his new life began to set in. He was a political refugee, stripped of his passport, his company, his familiar routine, and his country. He was professionally stateless. Meanwhile, back at the Soviet embassy, Major Bulichev was preparing the detailed failure report, a document that would be scrutinized at the highest levels of the Soviet government. The official narrative was already being prepared for the Soviet press. Nureyev, they would claim, was mentally unstable and an arrogant traitor to the motherland who had disgraced the great tradition of Soviet ballet. The goal was to erase him from Soviet history, making his magnificent talent irrelevant by focusing only on his supposed character flaws. The KGB's psychological warfare began subtly. The embassy leaked carefully crafted reports to European contacts suggesting Nureyev was difficult, volatile, and deeply unreliable. They hinted that his defection was not political, but a hysterical reaction to being reprimanded for his hedonistic lifestyle. Nureyev's former colleagues from the Kirov Ballet, still reeling from the shock, were flown back to Moscow and subjected to immediate, brutal interrogations. They were required to sign statements denouncing Nureyev as a decadent homosexual and an ungrateful party member. The message was clear: dissent would not only destroy the defector, but would also poison the lives of those who remained silent. In Paris, the French government officially confirmed his political asylum status. Nureyev was now legally safe, but professionally and emotionally, he was vulnerable. He had burned his bridges, cut his roots, and stepped into an uncertain future. He was the most coveted dancer in the world, but he was also a man alone, standing on a stage without a script, staring into a vast, free audience. He needed work, and fast. He needed to prove his value to the West, not just as a propaganda symbol, but as the transcendent artist he knew himself to be. The news of Rudolf Nureyev's defection ignited a furious, transatlantic bidding war. He was not just a dancer. He was a commodity of immense cultural and political value. Every major ballet company in the Western world understood that acquiring Nureyev would instantly elevate their status, filling their theaters and seizing the global media spotlight. The scramble was immediate, intense, and often undignified. In London, Dame Nanette de Valois, the formidable founder of the Royal Ballet, and Sir Frederick Ashton, the company's chief choreographer, recognized the opportunity with icy calculation. The Royal Ballet, while established, lacked the male star power to truly challenge the Soviet dominance in classical technique. Nureyev was the answer. They immediately dispatched feelers through diplomatic channels and private contacts in Paris. Across the Atlantic, George Balanchine, the Russian-born titan of the New York City Ballet, also reached out. Balanchine represented a different kind of freedom, the freedom of modern, abstract expression, and he saw in Nureyev the raw material for his own genius. But it was a smaller, more dynamic company, Le Grand Ballet du Marquis de Cuevas in Paris, that moved with the necessary speed and informality. The company's director, an American émigré named Raimundo de Lorraine, reached out to Clara Saint. He offered Nureyev something more valuable than a high salary: immediate, high-profile work starting right away. Nureyev, ever practical and desperate to return to the stage to silence the fear for his family and the KGB's slander, accepted the immediate offer. He needed to be seen, to be electric, to cement his legendary status before the Soviet narrative of his instability could take root. He signed a contract, his first Western contract, a document he actually got to read and keep, a profound moment of personal agency. His debut performance in the West was scheduled only days after his defection. The pressure was unimaginable. He hadn't rehearsed with a new company. He was psychologically drained, and he was dancing on the edge of a public relations catastrophe. If he failed, if he showed weakness, the KGB's claim of his mental collapse would gain traction. Back in Moscow, the KGB's first chief directorate, specifically Department V, responsible for cultural influence and counterintelligence, was monitoring every move. Agents Sokolov and Bulichev had been recalled and were undergoing rigorous, highly unpleasant debriefings. The official Soviet response had hardened. Nureyev was now designated a non-person, and the campaign to undermine him professionally and personally intensified. The KGB began to plant stories in less reputable European papers, painting Nureyev as an impossible egoist, an erratic partner, and a technical dancer whose training was already fading. More sinisterly, they escalated the psychological pressure on his family. His mother received a sudden, unannounced visit from a local party official, a meeting that was polite, yet devastatingly clear. Her son was a traitor, and her quality of life was now directly tied to her public condemnation of him. She was instructed to write a letter to the Western press, pleading for her wayward son to return home and save his soul. Nureyev was preparing for his Paris debut when he received word of the potential letter. The news hit him like a physical blow. He knew the anguish his mother was under. This was the KGB's genius, using love as a weapon. In response, Nureyev had to execute a defensive media strategy. In his first major press conference, his voice firm despite his fear, he publicly stated his love for his mother and his siblings, but clarified the political reality. He appealed directly to the international community to understand that any communication from his family would be forced and coerced by the Soviet regime. He emphasized that his defection was not a rejection of his family, but a rejection of the system that controlled them. The Paris debut was not merely a performance. It was a political statement. The night was packed with journalists, diplomats, and cultural elite. When Nureyev walked onto the stage of the Theatre de Champs-Élysées, the sheer weight of the moment was visible. He was to dance the Bluebird pas de deux from the Sleeping Beauty. He was brilliant. He didn't just dance the steps. He attacked them with a furious, defiant energy, his leaps soaring higher, his turns faster, his presence blazing. It was a performance fueled by adrenaline, fear, and a desperate need to survive. The audience erupted in a frenzied, 10-minute standing ovation. The message was unmistakable. The KGB's non-person was an undeniable artistic genius, and he was now the West's. The thunderous applause that swept through the theater de Champs-Élysées echoed ominously within the cold, concrete walls of the KGB headquarters in Yasenevo, Moscow. The failure of the Luc Bourget extraction was bad enough. The subsequent, globally broadcast triumph of the defecting dancer was an unforgivable insult. It rendered the official Soviet narrative that Nureyev was a fated talent, mentally unstable, completely ridiculous. Major Bulachev and Agent Sokolov, relegated to desk duty pending the outcome of their internal investigation, were present during the review of Western press clippings. The mood in the secure conference room was frigid. A senior general, his face a mask of stone, slapped down a copy of the New York Times featuring a massive photo of Nureyev taking a bow, sweat glistening under the stage lights. He is not a non-person. The general spat, the contempt palpable. He is a sensation. The world is watching. And we, comrades, allowed this parasite to become a symbol of Western degeneracy. The strategy shifted immediately from mere slander to direct, targeted psychological warfare. The objective was to destabilize Nureyev, to break his concentration, and, if possible, induce him to return voluntarily, or at least to undermine his standing by revealing his internal conflict. They knew his deepest vulnerability, his mother, Frida Nureyeva, living quietly and modestly in Ufa. The next day, a mid-ranking KGB operative, accompanied by a local party secretary, paid a visit to Farida's small, communal apartment. The atmosphere was carefully constructed to be intimidating, but not openly violent. The operative, a quiet man with bureaucratic efficiency, laid out a sheet of official stationery on her worn kitchen table. "Comrade Nureyeva," the operative began, his tone falsely solicitous, "your son Rudolf is lost and confused. He has been corrupted by bad influences. We know you love him. We know you want him back safe." He then placed a draft of a letter on the table. The letter, carefully crafted by the KGB's psychological warfare specialists, was addressed to the French government and the international press. It was a heart-wrenching plea from an aging, distraught mother, begging her son to abandon his decadent path and return to the motherland, where he belonged. It emphasized his duty, his ingratitude to the Soviet training, and the immense grief his absence caused his family. Farida, a proud, resilient woman who had endured poverty and war, was emotionally paralyzed. She understood the implicit threat, refused to sign, and her life, and the lives of her other children, would become intolerable. Sign, and she would become an unwitting weapon against her own son's freedom. With trembling hands, guided by the insistent, patient operative, she signed her name. Within 48 hours, the letter was delivered through Soviet diplomatic channels to the French Foreign Ministry and simultaneously released to a sympathetic wire service. The story exploded across the West, a calculated counterpoint to Nureyev's recent stage triumph. The headlines were devastatingly personal. Nureyev's mother begs him to return. Defector's family pain revealed. In Paris, the news struck Nureyev like a physical blow. He received a translation of the letter, and its words, though clearly couched in Soviet propaganda, pierced his defenses because he knew the genuine love behind the coerced plea. The KGB had successfully put him in an impossible ethical bind. His friend, Clara Saint, and his new employer, Raimundo de Lorraine, urged him to denounce the letter as a blatant Soviet fabrication. But Nureyev hesitated. He could not lie about his mother's desperation, even if the words were not hers. He spent a long, agonizing night alone, pacing his temporary sanctuary. The stage triumph now felt hollow, overshadowed by the very real, immediate suffering of the woman who had nurtured his talent. He understood the KGB's game. They wanted him to be publicly torn, to show the world that his freedom came at an unacceptable moral price. When he finally emerged to face the press, His eyes were heavy with fatigue and torment, a visible manifestation of the internal battle. He did not denounce the letter. He acknowledged the immense pain of his mother, confirming her emotional truth while simultaneously rejecting the political coercion. "The letter is written by my mother's hand." "Yes," Nureyev stated, his voice low but steady, his French now slightly stronger. "But the words, the politics, those belong to the men who hold her hostage. I know her heart. She wants me safe. But safety in the Soviet Union means the death of my spirit. I am free to dance now, and I will continue to dance for the entire world until the day I can dance for her free again. My freedom is my gift to her. It is the freedom she never had." It was a powerful, nuanced response that cleverly disarmed the KGB's trap. He confirmed the coercion while reaffirming his own commitment to freedom, transforming the KGB's psychological attack into a testament to his own principles. However, the emotional toll of knowing his mother was suffering under the regime's pressure was a shadow that would follow him onto every stage for years to come. The KGB had failed to retrieve the dancer, but they had succeeded in ensuring he would never fully be at peace. The intensity of the Paris media frenzy and the shadow of the KGB's psychological warfare convinced Nureyev and his advisors that he needed to move. The French sanctuary, while firm, was too close to the Soviet embassy's reach, both physically and through the local press. London offered a slightly greater distance and the professional stability of the world's most revered prima ballerina. In the autumn of 1961, just a few months after his dramatic airport dash, Rudolf Nureyev made the crossing to England. The Royal Ballet, under the direction of Dame Ninette de Valois, formally offered him a contract. It was not a permanent position. They were cautious about hiring a volatile, politically charged figure, but it was an immediate partnership with the company's untouchable star, Margot Fonteyn. Fonteyn was 42, established, elegant, and the undisputed queen of British ballet, her career thought to be gently winding down. Nureyev was 23, fiery, explosive, and technically revolutionary. The partnership was an unprecedented risk, a clash of generations, styles, and temperaments. But on stage, it became an alchemy that redefined ballet for the modern era. The KGB, still focused on undermining Nureyev, viewed the burgeoning partnership with alarm. They had underestimated the power of his raw talent to transcend the political noise. Their surveillance reports, now filtered through the London residency, detailed every rehearsal, every public outing, and every new friendship. They noted the instantaneous, almost mythic connection between the two dancers. Agent Sokolov, having survived the internal inquiry with a severe reprimand but his rank intact, was given a new, subtle assignment: monitor the Nureyev-Fonteyn dynamic. The center theorized that if they could create friction, if they could feed the inevitable professional jealousies that exist in any elite company, they might destabilize Nureyev's position, isolating him professionally. The KGB began planting rumors, not overtly political this time, but deeply personal and professional, suggesting that Nureyev was secretly contemptuous of Fonteyn's age, that he was demanding too much creative control, and that his ego was making him impossible to work with. These rumors were whispered through cultural attaches and sympathetic contacts in the arts community, designed to poison the well. But the reality of the partnership defied the KGB's machinations. Nureyev and Fonteyn found in each other a professional salvation. Fonteyn's career received a shocking rejuvenation, energized by Nureyev's passion and athleticism. Nureyev, in turn, gained the legitimacy and protection of the most respected name in the West. Her gravitas shielded him from the political attacks. Her poise helped temper his natural volatility. Their first performance together in Giselle at the Royal Opera House was a cultural earthquake. Nureyev brought a raw, passionate masculinity to the role of Albrecht that stunned critics used to the more subdued British style. The curtain calls were legendary, the audience demanding dozens of bows, captivated by their symbiotic energy. The applause was so loud and so sustained that it literally drowned out the KGB's carefully manufactured rumors. The center was forced to acknowledge the failure of its subtle sabotage. Nureyev was not only surviving, he was thriving, building an impenetrable fortress of genius around himself. His value as an artistic symbol was growing exponentially, making any attempt at overt action, like a physical retrieval, impossible without provoking a major international crisis. Sokolov's reports back to Moscow noted the extreme difficulty of penetrating Nureyev's inner circle. He was paranoid, rightly so, and relied heavily on Fontaine's established British security and the protective cordon of his new European friends. He moved constantly, accepting guest spots across the continent, becoming a truly transnational star and making him a maddeningly difficult target to track and compromise. The KGB's focus shifted again. If they couldn't retrieve him and couldn't destroy his career, they would focus on isolating him psychologically and ensuring he could never truly return home, even a visit. The next phase of the operation would be legal and symbolic, the trial of the traitor. They would try him in absentia, condemning him not just as a cultural deviant, but as a criminal of the state. The Soviet Union reacted to Nureyev's sustained success in the West with calculated fury. By 1962, the initial political shock had morphed into a deliberate, long-term strategy of isolation. Since they could neither retrieve him nor destroy his public appeal, the KGB and the party leadership moved to finalize his legal and symbolic erasure from the motherland. This meant a show trial, designed to condemn him as a warning to any other Soviet artist contemplating defection. The trial of Rudolf Nureyev took place in late 1962 in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. It was a quiet internal affair deliberately shielded from international observers, but its outcome was intended to be broadcast selectively and painfully to the West, and, more importantly, to the Soviet people. Nureyev was tried in absentia, meaning he was not present to defend himself, on charges of treason and betraying the motherland. The Soviet legal system, a malleable tool of the party, ensured a swift and damning verdict. The prosecution presented the evidence gathered by Agent Sokolov and his colleagues during the Kirov tour, transcripts of conversations with Westerners, records of extravagant purchases, and testimonies coerced from the Kirov functionaries and Nureyev's former colleagues, all painting a picture of an ungrateful, avaricious opportunist whose actions were premeditated and politically motivated. The narrative crafted by the KGB and approved by the center was simple. Nureyev had deliberately undermined the principles of Soviet art for the sake of material gain and bourgeois decadence. The fact that he accepted money for his performances in the West was twisted into trafficking in Soviet cultural property. The witnesses for the prosecution, including the Kirov functionaries who had guarded him at Le Bourget, were forced to denounce him with escalating fervor. They testified that he was morally rotten, a danger to the socialist collective, and a spy who had passed artistic secrets to foreign enemies. The psychological pressure applied to these witnesses was immense. Their denunciations were their guarantee of continued freedom and employment. The court delivered the inevitable verdict. Rudolf Nureyev was found guilty of treason and sentenced to 7 years in a hard labor camp, a symbolic, non-implementable punishment that nonetheless carried the full legal weight of the state. Crucially, the court also decreed that any return to Soviet territory would result in his immediate arrest and incarceration. The significance of the trial lay not in the sentence itself, which was impossible to enforce, but in the creation of a permanent, legal barrier. Nureyev was now an official criminal, effectively banned from ever stepping onto Soviet soil. The KGB had successfully leveraged the state apparatus to ensure his permanent exile. They had cut him off from the only emotional anchor he truly possessed, the possibility of seeing his mother again. When the news reached Nureyev, now traveling constantly between London, New York, and La Scala, he reacted with a fury that stunned those around him. He didn't fear the labor camp. He feared the finality of the separation from his family. The KGB had aimed their final blow directly at his heart. He issued a defiant, impassioned statement to the Western press, condemning the trial as a farcical charade and an act of cowardice by a regime that fears art more than bombs. He asserted that his real crime was simply seeking the freedom to dance without political constraint. Despite the public defiance, the sentence weighed heavily. It fueled a desperate drive in his career, a constant, manic pursuit of perfection and global dominance, as if his success could somehow negate the legal condemnation. He became more demanding, more volatile in rehearsals, channeling the rage and sorrow into his art. He threw himself into new, challenging works with Fontaine and others, determined to prove the Soviet court wrong with every spectacular leap. The KGB in Moscow marked the operation as a complex success. They failed to retrieve the asset, but they had neutralized his symbolic danger within the Soviet sphere and successfully applied long-term psychological damage. For Rudolf Nureyev, the Cold War was not a distant political conflict. It was a permanent personal scar, a 7-year sentence hanging over his head, defining his brilliant, tormented life in exile. The years immediately following the in absentia trial in Leningrad saw Rudolf Nureyev's career explode into what the Western press dubbed Nureyev mania. He became more than a dancer. He was a global phenomenon, a fashion icon, a revolutionary figure in the arts, and the undisputed embodiment of artistic freedom against Soviet oppression. He was constantly moving, a deliberate countermeasure to the fixed nature of his KGB pursuers. In London, New York, Vienna, and Milan, Nureyev commanded astronomical fees and unprecedented creative control. The partnership with Margot Fontaine became the love duo, a theatrical miracle that filled every seat in every opera house. His image, the fierce eyes, the wild hair, the leopard skin coats, was instantly recognizable, turning ballet from an elite art form into pop culture spectacle. This very visibility was his best defense. The KGB, however, did not forget him. The initial phase of hot pursuit and psychological warfare subsided, replaced by a cold, persistent, low-level operational maintenance. Nureyev was now a permanent line item on the Soviet intelligence budget. His file was labeled Target Pegasus. Agent Sokolov, having been reassigned to a surveillance role in the London residency, found his job frustratingly passive. He was not to attempt retrieval or direct sabotage anymore, but simply to monitor and report, to gather intelligence on Nureyev's political opinions, his increasingly influential Western friends, and, most importantly, his personal vulnerabilities. The center was playing a long game, waiting for the political climate to shift or for Nureyev's own intense, reckless lifestyle to provide an opportunity for compromise. Sokolov's reports detailed the dancer's movements. November 1963, rehearsing with George Balanchine in New York, associating with influential American politicians. March 1964, acquires property in London, maintains close contact with Clara Saint, a known anti-Soviet activist. July 1965, frequent contact with wealthy art patrons, potential sources of anti-Soviet funding. The KGB's attempts to communicate were always subtle, veiled as artistic admiration. At a performance in Rome, a minor Soviet cultural attaché, a known KGB contact, approached Nureyev backstage under the guise of offering congratulations. The conversation, meticulously recorded by the attaché, was a carefully structured attempt at establishing a line of communication. "Your mother sends her thoughts, Rudolf," the attaché murmured, avoiding eye contact. "She is well, but she misses you greatly. Perhaps one day, the circumstances will allow a reconciliation with the motherland." Nureyev, instantly alert, his eyes blazing, cut him off mid-sentence. He had become adept at identifying these approaches. "My mother can write to me directly, not through Moscow's lackeys. And reconciliation requires freedom, not a forced return to prison." He shot back, before dramatically turning his back and walking away. His paranoia was not irrational, it was essential. He insisted on separate hotel rooms for his security detail, changed travel plans without notice, and used disposable phone lines. He knew the KGB was listening, and he spoke Russian sparingly in public, aware that any unguarded comment could be twisted and used as leverage against him or his family. One evening in Paris, a close friend of Nureyev's was approached by a complete stranger who identified himself as a former Kirov dancer. The stranger claimed he had a message from Nureyev's sister, an emotional plea to meet discreetly and receive a packet of family photographs. The friend, recognizing the classic KGB bait-and-lure technique, immediately refused and reported the contact to Nureyev. The photographs were bait. The meeting would have been an opportunity for surveillance, or worse, a quick, illegal snatch and grab on a dark street, an operation far less risky than a daylight airport chase. The constant tension took a toll. The man who soared effortlessly across the stage was off-stage, often irritable, demanding, and moody. His closest friends understood this was the price of his exile and his unique status. He was living the dream of freedom, but he was doing so under a continuous, invisible sentence, forever looking over his shoulder. The KGB had failed to stop him, but they had succeeded in trapping him in a world of perpetual motion and distrust. They had ensured that his freedom would always be tainted by the sorrow of the life he lost and the guilt of the family he left behind. The dancer had escaped the airport, but he could not escape the Cold War itself. The 1970s and 1980s saw Rudolf Nureyev solidify his status as a legendary figure, choreographer, director, and still, miraculously, a dancer of staggering endurance. His defection in 1961 was now a historic footnote that lent an exotic, defiant luster to his celebrity. He was wealthy, internationally respected, and a citizen of the world, adopting Austrian citizenship for travel ease. Yet, the emotional vacuum left by his exile and the permanent scar of the KGB's sentence never truly healed. Agent Sokolov, having been promoted and brought back to Moscow headquarters, continued to manage the Pegasus file. The strategy had evolved with the times, with the Soviet Union facing internal decay and the cost of confrontation rising. The focus shifted from active retrieval to preventing any symbolic return or reconciliation. The KGB would maintain the legal status of traitor in the in absentia sentence, ensuring Nureyev remained politically radioactive. Nureyev's one constant, gnawing desire was to see his mother, Farida, one last time. As she aged, the possibility of a meeting became an obsession. He made discreet, back-channel inquiries through Western governments and highly trusted friends, offering huge sums of money to arrange a simple, neutral meeting, perhaps in Helsinki or Vienna. Every single attempt was meticulously documented and stonewalled by the KGB. The center understood that a tearful, public reunion between the infamous defector and his mother would instantly undermine 30 years of Soviet propaganda that painted him as a morally bankrupt outcast. It would humanize the traitor and expose the regime's cruelty. The answer was always a cold, unyielding yet. However, the political landscape was shifting beneath the Iron Curtain. By the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost were beginning to fracture the rigid control of the party and the security services. The KGB's power was slowly eroding, and the need for international goodwill was increasing. In 1987, Nureyev received a coded message through an unexpected source, a Soviet cultural official visiting Paris who was, crucially, known to be a reformist and distant from the traditional KGB power structure. The message was unofficial, almost reckless. His mother, Farida, was gravely ill, dying of a degenerative disease. Her final wish was to see her son. Nureyev was thrown into an emotional maelstrom. This was the moment he had dreamt of and feared. To go meant risking his freedom. The 7-year sentence still stood. To refuse meant living with the lifelong guilt of denying his mother's last wish. He contacted his French and Austrian government contacts. They warned him that while Gorbachev's policies were progressive, the old hardliners in the KGB and the military could still order his arrest upon arrival. The risk was monumental. He would be flying into a political minefield, relying on the goodwill of a reformist government that might not be able to control its own security apparatus. Nureyev, however, was resolute. The risk of the Gulag was less terrifying than the guilt of permanent separation. He used his immense influence to establish two critical conditions. First, he must be allowed to travel without his Austrian passport, on a special visa, ensuring he did not officially submit to the Soviet legal system. And second, the visit must be kept absolutely secret until he was safely out of the country. The negotiation was tense, conducted over weeks through back channels. The KGB, realizing the international outcry and arrest would provoke during this era of glasnost, finally, reluctantly, consented, not out of compassion, but out of fear of negative publicity. They viewed this as a controlled, limited engagement, a necessary evil. In the autumn of 1987, 26 years after his daylight dash, Rudolf Nureyev flew to Moscow on a heavily controlled, secret visa. Agent Sokolov was tasked with managing the operation, a bitter irony, supervising the temporary, grudging return of the man whose escape had nearly ruined his career. Nureyev was immediately put on a small, unmarked jet and flown to Ufa. He was accompanied by KGB personnel who ensured he stayed nowhere near any public place. He was taken directly to the remote hospital where his mother lay. The great dancer, the Prince of Exile, walked through the doors of a Soviet institution for the first time in over a quarter century. The full circle of his defiance was finally closing. Ufa, Bashkir USSR, November 1987. The Soviet winter was already biting, coating the provincial hospital in a thin layer of icy silence. The internal operation to manage Rudolf Nureyev's brief return was handled by the local KGB Bashkiria Directorate, strictly supervised by Moscow Center via encrypted communications. Every movement, every word was intended to be logged, but the atmosphere on the ground was less Cold War tension and more bureaucratic exhaustion. Rudolf Nureyev, dressed in an elegant Western coat that seemed impossibly luxurious against the drab hospital corridor, was escorted into a small, sterile room. He was alone, save for a uniformed nurse and the fading light of a November afternoon. He looked exactly like the man the world knew, fierce, restless, and radiating energy. But here, standing before the simple, narrow bed, he was only a son. His mother, Farida, lay frail and sunken into the pillows. Her face, which Nureyev had only seen in grainy, filtered photographs for 26 years, was etched with the hardship of her life and the progress of her illness. She was weak, barely conscious, but her eyes fluttered open as her son approached. Nureyev knelt by her bedside, taking her thin, warm hand in his, a hand that had once stitched his meager clothes and worried over his ambitious dreams. He spoke to her in Tatar, the language of his childhood, a private tongue that the KGB menders outside the door could not fully understand. His voice, usually powerful enough to project across an opera house, was a quiet, broken whisper pouring out decades of love, regret, and sorrow. "Mama, I am here. I am back," he repeated, gripping her hand tighter. Farida's eyes, clouded by illness, focused for a brief, searing moment. She made a weak effort to squeeze his hand, a silent acknowledgement across the vast political and geographical chasm that separated them. She said only a few words, simple, familial phrases that bypassed the trees in charge, the in absentia sentence, and the decades of propaganda. The meeting lasted less than 2 hours. The KGB's instructions were rigid. The defector was to minimize contact and maximize discretion. But within those 2 hours, the personal history of the Nureyev family, the sacrifice, the love, and the devastating cost of one man's freedom, was played out entirely. As he finally rose to leave, he kissed her forehead, the gesture of final farewell to the life and the world he had rejected. He walked out of the hospital, passing the grim, watchful faces of the security men, his posture straight, his head held high. He had faced down the system one last time, choosing love over caution, and had won the moral battle. The unmarked jet whisked him back to Moscow, then immediately onto a connecting flight out of the Soviet Union. Agent Sokolov's final report on the Pegasus file was laconic. Visit completed. Subject has departed Soviet territory. No security breaches or unauthorized contacts recorded. Rudolf Nureyev died a few months later. Rudolf Nureyev, the greatest male dancer of his generation, attended her memorial service in Paris. Forever exiled from the ground she was buried in. His defection at Le Bourget in 1961 was not just an airport escape. It was the moment the Soviet Union lost control of its most rebellious and shining artistic star. Nureyev's career, his freedom, and his eventual brief, heavily guarded return to his mother's side served as a continuous, elegant condemnation of the KGB and the closed world they represented. He escaped them in broad daylight and spent the rest of his life dancing in the full glare of the sun, an unforgettable symbol of the triumph of art and the individual spirit over the crushing weight of the Cold War state.